Now we are moving on to our second speaker, Samu Szemerey. Samu is an architect, an urbanist, consultant, and an educator, and he's a lead expert on urban technologies of the Lechner Knowledge Centre, and he's also a co-founder and director of content of CAKE, the Hungarian Contemporary Architecture Centre. Samu will talk about planning pedestrian-friendly cities and about the relationship between walkability and green spaces. So welcome, Samu, to the Academy session, and over to you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'll just share my screen. Let me know if it works or if it doesn't work.
You can see it.
Okay, good. So again, thanks a lot for the invitation. I'll talk about the walkability aspect, or at least start with that, and I'll also talk about green spaces and how these two might relate to each other. And I'll start with these two images, which really illustrate how people as a species, as an urban species, have been gathering together to live a significant part of their lives outside. And that is in urban spaces. And of course, for much of urban history, movement in cities was basically pedestrian movement. So people were walking around, and we built our cities from the whole layout of buildings all the way to the layout of streets and squares and public spaces around the activity of walking. So if we look at some of the, you could say, most ideal cities and the way we can understand them throughout history, this is a map of Rome, a very famous map of Rome that was the first one to provide a very interesting way of visualizing public spaces, extending from the streets and public squares to actual interior courtyards and interior spaces that were publicly accessible. Then you can see how pedestrian networks were actually a very sophisticated and multi-layered network. It's not only about streets where you can pass from point A to point B, but the whole activity of walking was surrounded by a network of services, spatial configurations, often green areas as well, that supported a way of life. Now, this is a way of life that by the 20th century was largely challenged by the emergence of new technologies, some of which were promoting the efficiency of urban services, and the way to promote that was through motorized transportation, so increasing the speed of mobility, increasing and separating pedestrian networks and faster speed cars that were kind of exploding in our cities. And that very significantly changed the urban environment that we know about, even though sometimes we talk about the very same buildings and the same environment. So this is an image of Copenhagen from the 1960s, where you see a historic environment that had been built largely for pedestrians, but was taken over by cars. And I'm sure all of you can bring up an image of this sort from your own respective cities, either from the second part of the 20th century or even sometimes from today. So these the whole idea of walkability, of urban spaces which are attractive to walking and which support walking and pedestrians and cyclists, so basically non-motorized mobility, came as a reaction to much of what was taking place throughout the 20th century, focusing on sort of efficacy and effective use and functional use of cities, which turned out to be much less profitable for cities, both literally and in terms of health and lifestyle, than the planners thought initially. So this is the outset on which the whole idea of walkability starts, of how the act of walking, the mobility, provided services, and the whole ecosystem that supports walking can be regained from motorized transportation. The way to do that was basically coming largely from transportation planning, where some of the activities that came up around motorized transport, largely that were actually measuring the numbers and the way motorized transport was functioning, these were extended to map pedestrian use of cities. some of these pioneering studies basically didn't do much more than apply the same principles and the same methods to pedestrians that had been used for cars already. So one basic information to collect was basically how many pedestrians use a certain space, because we had information about how many cars are passing through a certain street, but we didn't have any information about pedestrians because these were not measured. So applying the traffic metrics to people and pedestrians is one key aspect that is today, of course, much easier and much more widespread with data collection and digital sensors that enables us to create a map and a visualization of the uses of public spaces that can actually provide us arguments in the transportation planning and even in the economic context supporting the pedestrianizing or repedestrianizing of urban areas. So one of it is mapping how public spaces are being used. This is more of a qualitative mapping. Of course, there are many methods for this. The second I already talked about. And then the third key aspect here was a series of gradual interventions, often running through several years or decades even, that gradually changed the urban environment by, for example, removing parking places 2 or 3% every year, and then monitoring the effects and, of course, adjusting accordingly based on what the purposes and what the outcomes were. So some of the initial ways of understanding how people use spaces came. This is an example from New York. Some of the famous studies were done there, and the others were done in Copenhagen in several cities. But these were basically architects and planners going out almost as a kind of a field work to an unknown territory to understand how people are behaving and what they're doing and for how much time they're doing this in certain areas. There are a number of key books coming out in this area. Some of these were turned into films, and some of these have been developed into very well-known methods. But the way of understanding of how pedestrians are actually using spaces and what are the ecosystems that collect or concentrate around pedestrian areas is fairly recent compared to how long we have been using our cities as pedestrians. And then many documents came out of this, which were more on the kind of planning side and the proposal side, which are documents often not thought of in city management and public administration. One of the key documents in this case is a series of reports which are published by Copenhagen roughly every decade, which show the life and the status of public spaces, which kind of an evaluation of where the city is standing and what the goals are and where they want to go. Just by establishing this document and publishing this document over the ages, this itself created a lot of processes in public administration that were actually driving changes in many areas. The key goal that many cities define by walkability is that most everyday activities should be accessible or even happen mostly on foot or on bicycles. So this is a kind of a fairly simple definition of how we understand walkability in cities. The ability to actually do or live your everyday life without having to sit in your car, but just to walk around. This is also referring to the idea of the compact city or the 15-minute city or the cities of short distances that we heard about in the previous presentation. And of course, this means if we take this statement seriously, which seems like a very simple statement, then this has very dramatic consequences in all areas of planning and urban development, from services to transportation to real estate investments and housing. And so this is actually a statement that cities can build a whole set of strategies around. And it also sets up a line of priorities where basically the idea of urban life, so activities, the ecosystems of small businesses, of services accessible from the street or from walking and cycling, are more important than, for example, the quality of urban spaces themselves as a design activity. And urban spaces themselves are more important than buildings. And this is this again sounds kind of simple, but it's actually a very radical statement. especially for planners and architects who have throughout the 20th century tended to think the other way around, that designing buildings which are of very high quality and very attractive is more important or more reasonable from an investment perspective than actually investing in designing good urban spaces. And especially planners or architects often think they have little to do with how urban life is actually lived and how it develops on our streets. So by setting this priority, you can also prioritize, or a city can prioritize the resources and the efforts that they put into how they want to create an environment in the city where businesses and locals and various services and institutions can live together and support each other in a sustainable way. So getting back to Copenhagen, this is the simple strategy of Copenhagen's public space development, which is very much about urban life. So which should be offered to everyone more every year. So this is about creating more opportunities and options for people to access various services and activities and to live their lives on public spaces, to increase the amount and the diversity of people on foot, because this has serious consequences in health, improvements in personal health and the general health and way of life of cities, and the general idea of having people spend more time on public spaces. So these areas have several effects in sometimes unexpected ways as well. So the quality of life is, of course, an immediate and easy to understand improvement that places have where pedestrians are prioritized over motorized transport. But there's also research showing that businesses actually are more profitable and more sustainable in pedestrianized areas where they have an opportunity to connect with customers on a more direct basis than people who have to drive up to a parking lot and then walk from that parking lot to the service and to access the service or the businesses. So in fact, walkable areas and walkable streets support business development and support the economy of our cities. Public safety is greatly improved in walkable areas because, as we know from studies going back to the 1960s, eyes on the street, which are the eyes of the local community who are keeping an eye on what's happening outside of their businesses or outside of their homes, is the best way and the most sustainable way to provide safe and attractive environments. And of course, the objective safety of a walkable area is one thing, and then the perceived safety, so the idea that the image of a certain street is that it's a secure and safe area for various communities or individuals, is a psychological thing, but that's also created by the knowledge that many people are walking there 24 hours a day, or at least throughout most hours a day. And finally, but not least, neighborhood cohesion is a key aspect. So the support of communities, I think this is something that we all experienced in 2020 as an especially important factor of cities, of how local communities can support each other and how they can live at times of, for example, a pandemic that we're going through right now. So walkable areas and walkable neighborhoods are also neighborhoods where the local communities tend to be more connected, and they tend to be more involved in providing and managing their own environment and the way of life that's happening there. So the general idea of a widespread participation in how our own environment is managed and developed is also supported by walkable cities. Another way of looking at walkability is looking at, as we discussed already, partly services and how these services can be accessed. And this is a study that we did in recent years, or we developed a toolkit that is looking at the layout of services in cities and the density of services, and compares that with the urban typology, the urban forms of street networks and the facades. And this, by combining this data, we can provide information on how attractive and how accessible are in terms of urban services in certain parts of the city, and how their form, how their urban layout and the street networks actually influence the way they develop and what kind of functions move into there. So the accessibility of services is something that is intimately linked to the walkability, and there are ways to look at various sections of this phenomenon. Okay, but how do we get to green spaces? As we've heard in the previous presentation, green spaces are not only about public parks. Green infrastructure is blue and green infrastructure is a key element of urban life. But if we look at the aspects of walkability, which are often about how cities function, there's also a way to connect walkable streets, walkable urban areas, and green spaces and green infrastructure development. In the ideal case, the development of green infrastructure can actually coincide or significantly overlap with the development of walkable networks. And similarly, we could say an infrastructure of walking in cities. So obviously, green spaces are not only for recreation, and of course, they're not only at the scale of parks. Green is an element of streets, but also it happens in a multi-layered structure of semi-private and private areas, which start from the homes to the shared spaces of urban housing, where typically several people live together in their own apartments. So they share some common spaces, such as a courtyard or some lobby space or a roof garden. And then extend to streets, which are often very intimate and they are connected to the immediate neighborhood, and then to avenues or more streets with more traffic and more linked to larger urban hubs. So, and of course, when we talk about green infrastructure, as we've seen in the previous presentation, again, there are various and a diverse way of putting green or biologically active units, elements, plants, and others in these areas on facades, on street levels, and there's a huge number of ways we can approach this. And of course, this also creates a diversity of functions and a diversity of looks of how green infrastructure actually appears for its users. But what's also important that it also creates resilience in terms of environmental challenges, but also health challenges. And finally, there's a measurable difference between how attractive streets with or without green surfaces look. Walkers, pedestrians always favor streets with trees or with green, which is well maintained, to streets where you don't see any of that. But of course, there's a way to approach green infrastructure from let's say a more scientific and objective and a less objective, more subjective factor. So when we talk about air quality, environmental protection, resilience, shades, or mitigation of heat islands, these tend to be more abstract information that are important for people who are concerned for some personal or other reason about the environmental or climate change or environmental effects. But there's a much more immediate subjective question, which is about basically the preference for walking in certain areas or avoiding certain areas. So there's a question of, is this nice? Is this green well maintained? Does it look good? And when we talk about infrastructure, this is a question that rarely came up in recent decades when we talk about planning urban infrastructure. But in the case of green infrastructure, and increasingly about other infrastructure elements as well, it is a key question of how we design, how we think of our infrastructure as urban decision makers and planners and architects, whether it will attract walkers or whether it will look like a technical zone that has reduced accessibility. And of course, walkers attract other walkers. So if there's a popular street, or that's a street or an area that puts a lot of effort into becoming walkable, and it's actually starts to work, then it will work as a magnet that will attract others as well. So there's this can be seen as a kind of a strategy to communicate, how to communicate, and how to build even the branding of walkable areas in cities. Some of this is planned, some of this is more spontaneous. This is a case from Budapest from 4 years ago, where this bridge was closed down for a couple of months for renovations that were happening next to the bridge, but traffic was blocked off. And it became a spontaneous gathering spot for people because it provided a view of the city that was otherwise previously not accessible. And after some frictions with the authorities and the municipality of Budapest, everyone realized that this is the best version of all possible scenarios, that a place which is blocked off from motorized traffic becomes one of the most attractive public spaces of the city. And of course, here we can talk more about the blue infrastructure of the Danube than green infrastructure of the trees. But this often happens spontaneously. And I think the question for a city is whether they can allow and what are the frameworks that they can create to enable and then to support such often spontaneous activities. And if they recognize this functional need, how can they bring it over to other areas of planning and policy making? So when we think about planning walkable areas, of course, walkability and green are tightly connected, but green areas are not the only, and of course not even the biggest influence on walkability of urban spaces. Traffic and transportation is much more important, for example, but these are interlinked. And green areas can also be an obstacle or a repellent factor if they're not well maintained. There are several examples in my city of Budapest as well, and in others as well, where there is an established park or a green area, but it's not being maintained properly, and it's more of a distraction and something that people would want to avoid because of its status. So good maintenance is key when we talk about green infrastructure development. Relatively new and very influential question about developing these areas is developing new ownership models and shared management. It's not only about a certain utilities company managing a park or a set of trees, but several cities are experimenting with shared management models where local stakeholders, local communities are also invested in maintaining the environment and the streets. There are very interesting, often business models for this, of how each stakeholder can find their own motivation to actually participate on a daily basis on managing their own spaces, and what the digital platforms might be to actually facilitate this process. These are new types of engagements for cities and public administration, but I think that we will see an increasing number of such technological and process solutions coming into urban planning and design processes. And of course, this is also linked to innovative zoning tools and regulations, which recognize new toolkits previously not seen as part of mainstream planning, such as temporary and pop-up events like the one we saw on the bridge example, or regulation components that were developed by Copenhagen, such as edge zones, which are these kind of immediate zones next to building facades on the street, and how these can be thought of as areas of a diversity of activities besides just transportation or traffic. And then this, of course, goes back to regulating how facades are being planned on ground floors and what are the expectations in terms of urban space to create a better, more sustainable, walker-friendly, and of course, environmentally sustainable environment as well. For the management models, these often come again from a surprising context. There's an interesting case in Bratislava where the old market hall building was closed down for several years. This was owned by the city, and then it was reopened by an alliance of cultural actors, NGOs, and businessmen who created a model of operation for the building. This is in the heart of the city, the old downtown. That proved to be not only sustainable but also profitable. They could invest in renovating the building. They could invest in a sustainable farmers market that was supporting restaurants in the neighborhood. And then gradually they actually expanded into developing a management model or a development model and the future vision for the urban spaces which are in the neighborhood of the market hall. So they became through a support by the city and a kind of encouragement and empowerment from an ad hoc alliance of various stakeholders to an actual force of urban development in an area that had been neglected for several years. So this goes on to urban policy, where we already mentioned the Urban Life Account, this regular report that is being published by cities. And just by doing such reporting, they already engage in a kind of knowledge building and the shift in priorities. And of course, this provides information for investors and businesses who might recognize how investing in green areas and walkable urban space can actually become a profitable business and not only just a public investment procedure that needs support from some central funding. And of course, policies also benefit from establishing these strategic toolkits of temporary project, bringing over several methodologies from IT development and sort of digital economies such as agile design and agile testing and service design methods that understand urban environment as a part of the services that we are attracted by, or we might engage with. And then just to close, the results in Copenhagen of engaging in such activities were a quadrupling of people staying outside in a climate that is not particularly friendly for outside activities in general. So from 1968 to 1995, there were 4 times as many people spending time outside on average. And the span of public activities expanded from 2 months of the summer to 10 months. So you could say technically all throughout the year. So this is how much it can mean if you support walkable areas and sort of diversity of activities that come with walkability and urban sustainability. So thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion later on. And under these links, you can find some resources and studies and methods that were developed by the organizations I work for.